Chicago, Illinois, 1904. Upton Sinclair has realized that, provided he carries a lunch pail, he can go basically anywhere, blending in with workers while walking the floors of Chicago's infamous slaughterhouses and packing plants, watching men work industrial meat cutters and grinders. His goal is to expose the grotesque labor abuses of the meat industry in a serialized novel he's writing for the socialist newspaper Appeal to Reason. He sees workers lose fingers to saws and subsequently lose their jobs and financial security, witnesses the mistreatment of the largely Lithuanian immigrants working the factories, hears stories of men falling into meat grinders, minced with the meat, and sees foul droppings and diseased meat swept off the floor and put into sausages. The resulting novel, The Jungle, will spur Roosevelt's next big battle against the trusts. Thanks so much to CuriosityStream for helping to keep the history flowing. Despite being labeled a socialist by his conservative Republican rivals, Theodore Roosevelt in actuality had little regard for socialism. In fact, he was largely pro-business. Much like Ida Tarbell, he didn't particularly care how large the trusts got, provided they did it honestly. Actually, it could be argued that his reputation as a radical trustbuster is undeserved, since he didn't really bust most of the trusts he went after. He was really more of a trust regulator. In fact, Roosevelt didn't believe trusts were inherently bad, and he often admired the charity work undertaken by captains of industry like Rockefeller and Carnegie. And anytime someone proposed actual socialist policies, like nationalizing the railroads, Roosevelt generally ran the other direction, because he disliked socialism and socialists, and as a result was skeptical of Upton Sinclair's claims when he first read The Jungle. Particularly since Sinclair's novel ended with a heavy-handed scene of the protagonist attending a socialist meeting as a way to lecture and convert the reader. Despite that, he invited Sinclair to the White House to talk about the book and the conditions in the meat plants. Of course, he thought Sinclair was exaggerating and even referred to him as a crackpot. But if just a third of what Sinclair claimed was true, then that meant there was something very wrong in the nation's meat industry. The picture of poverty, exploitation, and the revoltingly unhygienic practices he'd painted in The Jungle was so viscerally upsetting to the public that both domestic and international orders for American meat dropped by half. So despite his skepticism, Roosevelt dispatched a group of his most trusted government officials to inquire about plant conditions. Surprise inspections, which the Meat Trust unfortunately got wind of and went on a 3-week sanitation campaign. But even that wasn't enough. When Roosevelt received the subsequent report, he was shocked to discover that Sinclair had not lied about factory conditions. They'd discovered unbelievable filth, from walls painted with old blood, to tuberculosis-infected beef being packaged for sale, to rotting pork being bathed in preservatives like formaldehyde and borax, to meat that was entirely mislabeled, passing off goat or horse as beef. Popular fury was so intense that this was one blow against the trusts Roosevelt wouldn't even have to fight for. He drew up 2 bills for the 1906 Congress. The first was the Pure Food and Drug Act, a wide-ranging statute that banned the foreign and interstate traffic of mislabeled, impure, or contaminated food and medicine. It allowed for the U.S. Bureau of Chemistry, later renamed the Food and Drug Administration, to carry out inspections and refer violations to prosecutors. It also required the food and drug manufacturers to label major ingredients, a provision striking out at both mislabeled meat and the U.S. patent medicine industry, which regularly sold products with secret ingredients that included cocaine and opium. In fact, many of these medicines were also loaded with sugars and flavoring, which led to a rash of children overdosing when they drank the bottles like candy. It also labeled 10 substances common in medicine, including alcohol, opium, cocaine, cannabis, and morphine, as addictive and dangerous, requiring that their presence be disclosed on the packaging. Products found in violation could be seized and destroyed at the company's expense, in addition to a fine. Next came the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which mandated Department of Agriculture inspections of every animal before and after slaughter, spelled out standards for sanitation at meat plants, and authorized the government to monitor operations. Despite these 2 victories, Sinclair himself was disappointed that people had fixated on food purity rather than the condition of workers. "I aimed for the heart," he reflected, "and hit them in the stomach." But even so, it was the end of an extraordinary legislative season. In fact, the 59th U.S. Congress was one of the most productive in history. In addition to the Pure Food and Drug Act, Meat Inspection Act, and Hepburn Railroad Rates Act, the 59th Congress also passed a key law regulating citizenship, an Antiquities Act allowing the president to declare national monuments, and chartered the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, which played a major role in developing American education. But despite all this success, it should be noted that the Food and Drug Act and Meat Inspection Act were compromises, watered down from what Roosevelt had truly hoped for. And compromise was something Roosevelt increasingly became familiar with during his last years in office. Because in the exuberance of his election night win in 1904, he'd made a promise that he now regretted. Having served nearly 2 terms due to McKinley's assassination, he had promised not to run again. And while that freed his hand to be more active and take politically risky positions in his second term, it also meant that both the trusts and conservative Republicans knew that they just had to wait him out. In 1908, he proposed a bill to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, but saw it shot down in Congress. He then tried to set up a National Bureau of Insurance in order to tame anti-consumer practices in the insurance markets, but that was dead on arrival as well. However, even without Congress, Roosevelt could effect change. Sometimes merely by the threat of an antitrust suit. Andrew Carnegie's U.S. Steel, the most prominent steel trust, actually voluntarily agreed to an investigation by the Bureau of Corporations, and other large trusts agreed to cooperate as well. But there was one time he couldn't help but let the trusts win. November 4th, 1907, the White House. The country is in a panic. Stock market dives and the sudden crash of several trust banks, wiping out depositors' savings, have plunged consumer confidence. People are terrified, moving their money out of the market, and worse, withdrawing it from banks. If this continues, the entire system might collapse. But J.P. Morgan, a man Roosevelt has tangled with when he filed an antitrust suit over the Northern Securities Company, has a plan. You see, part of this new panic of 1907 had come from a large brokerage house, borrowing massive sums with the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company as collateral. But now that TC&I stock price was collapsing, if U.S. Steel purchased TC&I, it would calm the markets. However, U.S. Steel already owns 60% of the steel market and doesn't want to face an antitrust suit as a monopoly. So they ask for Roosevelt to sign off on it personally. They will save the economy, but in return, he can't go after them for the purchase. It's Monday morning. The stock market will open in an hour. Roosevelt has to decide fast. He has no choice. He agrees to let the deal go through. Ultimately, Roosevelt would use the Sherman Antitrust Act 40 more times during his presidency, more than his 3 predecessors combined. And his ally and chosen successor, William Howard Taft, would use it 75 times. But while Roosevelt's battle against the trusts has become legendary, the results themselves were more mixed. As we mentioned previously, the breakup of Standard Oil, his biggest victory, may not have actually led to much more competition. In the 1920s, when Ida Tarbell wrote a retrospective article on Standard's breakup, she pointed out that over a decade later, the competition that the government had hoped to create hadn't yet materialized. Maybe, she suggested, it would take another decade for the results to truly begin to show. Indeed, in our modern day, we can actually see parts of Standard recombining via merger, with Exxon and Mobil joining forces. But it's important to note that even these megacorporations only have a fraction of the power Standard once had, particularly because they fear antitrust suits. Breakups are rare, but in 1982, AT&T was forced to divest itself of the Bell telephone system. A 1999 case came close to breaking up Microsoft, and as we wrote this series, the Justice Department filed an antitrust suit against Google, and the Federal Trade Commission, the successor to Roosevelt's Bureau of Corporations, filed another against Facebook. Which just goes to show that even a century later, the big questions of Roosevelt's era still live on. Should the government provide a check on unrestrained capitalism? How can Congress regulate when its members are financially tied to companies? And what role does the press play in all of this? Because while Theodore Roosevelt gave us the tools to act if warranted, the question of when to use them is still up to us. And if you're interested in learning more about other aspects of Teddy Roosevelt or a ton of other historical topics, then do we have a deal for you from our friends at CuriosityStream. As I'm sure you know by now, CuriosityStream is an online learning platform where you can watch thousands of amazing documentaries and award-winning original series on most every topic under the sun, and even some beyond it. For instance, I just watched a documentary with probably my favorite title ever, Hack the Moon, Unsung Heroes of Apollo, where I learned a ton about the space race and the people that navigated us to the moon and back using a fraction of today's technology. Seriously, it was like rocketing through the stars guided by a sliver of your cell phone, which then feels even more nuts when you hear that story accompanied by footage of the time. It's awesome. And because CuriosityStream loves supporting educational content and the people behind it, when you sign up, you'll also snag a year of Nebula, the By Creators for Creators platform we just became a part of, featuring original content from a ton of awesome creators we love, such as Tirzu, Jill Barup, and Kento Bento to name a few. Oh, and by the way, that's not just a trial we're talking about. It's a full account you have access to for free for the entire duration of your CuriosityStream subscription. Plus, Nebula even made it possible for us to create an extra history on the Tiger of Mysore, Tipu Sultan, which you'll also be able to get your paws on once you sign up. Now, surely all this content must cost an arm and a leg, right? Wait, really? A year of all that amazing goodness for under $15. All right then, I'm not their accountant. Visit curiositystream.com/extra credits to get a year of CuriosityStream and a year of Nebula for the discounted price of $14.97, which also helps support our channel at the same time. So thanks for that. It's the best dang deal in streaming, if you ask me and my cat. I don't want to brag, but Ahmed Ziad Turk, Alicia Bramble, Casey Muscha, Dominic Valenciana, Gunnar Clovis, Kyle Murgatroyd, and O'Reels1 are fantastic legendary patrons.